Okay, so a question that was asked is, should the 8 limbs of yoga be taken on in the order that they're represented in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali? So this is a good question, and it's something that people often assume that the answer to this is yes. So first of all, what are the 8 limbs of yoga? So 2,000 years ago, a man called Patanjali wrote a text called the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, or the Yoga Shastras of Patanjali. And he wasn't writing down new information, he was writing down something that already existed. A school of yoga called Ashtanga Yoga already existed, or a form of yoga called Ashtanga Yoga. And Patanjali simply codified it. He put it down in textual form. And part of his text are these 8 limbs. Ashtanga Yoga literally means the yoga of the 8 limbs. So these 8 limbs, and this is the order in which he lists them, are yama and niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, jhana, and samadhi. Okay, so what that means is the yamas and the niyamas are kind of codes of conduct by which we live our life. Not to kill, not to harm others, not to lie, not to steal, that kind of thing. After that came asana. Asana means posture. Okay, posture. It can also mean seat. And in those days, 2,000 years ago, in yoga, seat pretty much meant literally that, the posture that you would use to sit in. Pranayama are breathing practices used in yoga. So this is one of the earliest mentions of that term. Before Patanjali, you had the Buddha, who didn't talk about pranayama practices. You had Krishna with the Bhagavad Gita, again, didn't talk about breathing practices. So breathing practices were starting to be introduced kind of 2,000 years ago. After that comes pratyahara. This is the introversion of the senses, withdrawing the senses from outward sense objects and bringing them internally into the body, into the objects of the mind, and to the self, to pure awareness itself. That's pratyahara. After that, with the 8 limbs, comes dharana, concentration, and then jhana, merging of awareness with an object. And then finally comes samadhi, which is the transcendence of the mind, transcendence of the objects of the senses, transcendence of everything that moves, and coming to abide in the self alone. So those are the 8 limbs, Ashtanga. Now in his Yoga Sutras, or Yoga Shastra, Patanjali doesn't say that these should be taken on in any specific order. He simply says that these various limbs of yoga will cause the obstructions to dissolve. Okay? But no orders given. So what that means is someone could take those on in any order they want, or all at the same time. Patanjali doesn't specify any particular order. Now the last 3, dharana, jhana and samadhi, generally they have to come in a particular order, and they have to come in that order, because it's very rare to experience the transcendence of all objects without first having some concentration of mind and without merging awareness with the objects for transcendence occurs. So those last 3 have to come in a particular order, and the one before that, pratyahara, the introversion of the senses, often precedes those other three. So there is some order there. But if we said that the 8 limbs have to be taken on in the order that Patanjali listed them in his text, that would actually be quite dangerous. It would mean starting off with yamas and niyamas, which is potentially fine, but then adding asana and then adding pranayama. Now asana activates energy in the body, and so does pranayama. And if someone did that, they could easily end up in a position where they've just got too much energy being activated and not enough stillness, not enough equanimity, not enough peace, in order to make their whole journey of yoga one that is smooth, that is easy, that is without issues. So it could actually be dangerous to take on the 8 limbs of yoga in the order that they're presented by Patanjali. There is another potential problem with taking them on in the order that they're listed, and that's to do with the yamas and the niyamas. The yamas are fundamentally things to try not to do, things to try to avoid. Try to avoid stealing, try to avoid dishonesty, try to avoid harming others. Now that sounds good on paper, but if people try to do that in practice, it can actually result in repression. And when people try to not do things, if they haven't got that state of peacefulness established, that state of inner silence established, it can often lead to repression, a repressive state of mind. And when people repress things, they often bubble up in different ways. They'll often rise to the surface and express themselves later on. So it can actually be better to establish a meditation practice first, and then as our inner silence develops, as our equanimity develops, as our life begins to change as a result of that meditation practice, then we can naturally find ourselves wanting to follow the yamas and niyamas. We naturally don't want to harm animals. We naturally don't want to take that which isn't ours. We naturally don't want to be dishonest, and so on. So allowing the yamas and niyamas to flow out of a meditation practice can be a much more healthy way to go about things. So personally, I don't think of the 8 limbs of yoga as being something to take on in order, but more something to reflect on. It's more useful as a reflection practice. And then think about structured practice, which practices are actually more beneficial to begin with, which ones are more beneficial to add second, to add third, and so on.